I'm Dave Breckenridge, and this is Under the Dome. Alberta's vaccine passport program is no more. On Tuesday, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney announced the restrictions exemption program will be lifted immediately, and over the next several weeks, we would see the lifting of other COVID-19 restrictions so long as hospitalizations continued to decline. So where does Alberta go from here? And what are the politics at play? We discuss that on today's episode. My guest today is Calgary Herald columnist Don Braid. Don, thanks for joining me today.
Good to be here.
So, Don, Tuesday evening, Jason Kenney announced what a lot of people expected him to announce. The Alberta's vaccine passport program is ending. They're going to lift the mask mandates for kids, and eventually they're going to lift capacity restrictions on places like large entertainment venues, hockey arenas, things like that. What was your response to the Tuesday announcement? Was it as you expected it would be? Was it a little further along? Maybe too fast, too soon? What were your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I think the immediate abolition as of midnight for the vaccine passport was it was one of the options. I understood there was about 3 dates being considered: immediate, middle of the end of this week, Valentine's Day. It was a little bit of startling that he did it immediately because there's so many factors to consider. What about all the businesses that today don't have to ask for a vaccine passport? I bet you a lot of those business restaurants had no idea because they weren't watching TV last night or getting news this morning. So it was kind of abrupt. But I think the feeling was that if you're going to do it, you might as well do it clean. As for the announcement itself, I thought it was badly done. I thought the communication of the main message of it was clumsy. I thought there was some very strange skewing of support and understanding toward the unvaccinated, who Kenney actually compared to be discriminated against, like AIDS patients, people with AIDS, which is just bizarre. And Kenney, of course, apologized for that this morning. But it's also unbelievably contentious everywhere, particularly within his own caucus. And it was only last week that at a private caucus meeting, virtually everybody on the call agreed that measures should be dropped immediately. Now, if you want your reason why they did it immediately, that's a pretty darn good one. They took a sort of straw vote, and nobody said that they should be continued any longer, even past last Thursday. So that's the kind of pressure he was under.
Yeah, I was going to ask the idea that, he's doing this because his caucus is frustrated with the regulations, his base is frustrated with regulations, or even we've seen a blockade at the Coutts border crossing. Do we get the sense that he's caving to those elements of his party, or is he following what a lot of other jurisdictions are doing? He was quick to point out a laundry list of places that are, lifting all of their restrictions: England, Scotland, Ireland, Denmark, Quebec and Saskatchewan are looking at lifting their own restrictions. Is it following along with what other jurisdictions are doing because Alberta's in a good place to do it, or is it giving a sop to his base and perhaps some fringe elements in politics, or is it a bit of both?
I think it is a bit of both. I mean, there's no question. This is not like Open for Summer, where he was the only leader in Canada or anywhere who suddenly said, we're into an endemic phase now, we can just go have a good time, and had signs printed up and hats and everything for that hugely embarrassing and failed moment of policy making. But this time, there's no question that jurisdictions from BC to Quebec, Newfoundland, PEI yesterday as well. Scott Moe was up even before in Saskatchewan. Premier Saskatchewan was up even before Kenney, talking about their plans to drop the vaccine passport on the eve of Valentine's Day. So yeah, it's going on all over the place. But when Kenney is asked if the pressure from that side of his party or that point of view, which he fundamentally agrees with, but had to, I think, has always agreed with. He doesn't like these measures. He certainly didn't like the vaccine passport. But for him to just deny that there's any kind of pressure, political pressure on him is disingenuous and best, it seems to me.
Yeah, you mentioned the Open for Summer plan last year, which They lifted restrictions when we hit a 70% of the population with one dose of vaccine. And, there were a lot of other pieces to that around testing and maybe moving to an endemic stage too quickly. And then we got hit with this fourth wave. Part of the announcement on Tuesday was the idea that, we'll move to step one next week, which involves masking rules for kids in schools, but we won't move to step two until we see declining numbers of hospitalizations or declining hospitalization rate. How important is that for Kenney to have that caveat in there? And is it possible that, once we get to that stage, even if hospitalizations aren't declining, there may be more pressure to just move to step three anyway, because we're already at step two and people will kind of just be, well, we're already here, let's keep going.
Well, the move to the next big step, of course, the big emotional one is masks. And when does the mask mandate get lifted? And they are tying that to what happens with infections and hospitalizations. And, there's all kinds of debate about whether when he says we're on the downslope, is that actually true? The fact is that, hospitalizations, infections, positivity rate, they've come down, but they're still high. And at the very moment that Kenney was talking last night, Joe Bipon, the emergency ward doctor, was on the CBC saying it's just dangerous to do this now because we could get yet another bounce back. Nobody really knows. I mean, they're dealing with, you got to have sympathy too, I guess, because honestly, dealing with a virus that has a mind of its own, nobody can predict. It just keeps doing these bizarre things like Omicron. Who expected that? So given public sentiment, this is a direction that everybody seems to be moving in, and maybe they're right. Maybe we do need to live with this. But I think there's considerable risk in Alberta in what Kenney is doing. And frankly, I'm glad that the mask thing is going to continue a while longer. One of my things that seems important to me is building an atmosphere where there's tolerance for everybody's choice. Like, okay, when I go out with my mask on, and I'm a certain vintage, as you may have noticed, so we're pretty compliant. So after the mask bylaw is lifted, and I go out with a mask on, am I going to get harassed? Like Kenney was talking about the unvaccinated being unwelcome in restaurants, but he didn't talk about other people who make the other choice who've also been harassed. And I think what we need is a really strong, clear message about how everyone's choice in the age when we're moving toward no restrictions should really be honored. Otherwise, we're in for a backlash. So you would see a backlash situation developing with people who suddenly said, yeah, we were right, no more bylaw, no more masking, no more vaccine passport. We've been feeling oppressed for all this time, and now we're going to get our own back. And I didn't see any recognition of that. Now, just this morning, the Premier's office has disputed what I wrote about that, but I still didn't see any real effort to discuss that. And Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, meanwhile, did, I thought, a very good job of talking about that. He said, "Don't lose a friend to COVID." I thought that was a good way to put it.
Yeah, I got the sense, Jason Kenney did talk about, how families have been split apart by COVID and we need to be compassionate with one another. But I don't recall him specifically pointing out people who, when this is all over, may choose to err on the side of caution, or in some cases maybe be overly cautious, but he didn't specifically single them out. One of the questions that I found interesting, and we've kind of touched on the politics of it, was, the question the Premier was asked was along the lines of, are you doing this to help save your job on April 9th, I believe? And that's when he's facing a leadership review. And I noticed that he didn't answer directly. I'm sure that he doesn't want to be reminded of his leadership review and also doesn't want people thinking that that's why he's making decisions. But how much of this is tied to that vote among party members?
I think it's, to a degree, you could argue that it's all about that. I mean, what's happening now in riding after riding, particularly in the countryside, is that there's some memberships are going like hotcakes, and they're not going because people want to come to Red Deer on April 9th and applaud Jason Kenney. I talked to one MP the other day who who said it's never been so easy to sell memberships. And this is for a one-day meeting where you get to pay $100 in order to cast a vote. And that's if you register early. If you register a little later, it's going to cost $150. So it's a considerable thing. They're expecting about 2,800 people, like the sort of capacity, but they think, the party people, that is, think that they could cycle through maybe up to 4,000 or 5,000 people that day, because people come in, go out, they vote, that's it. There's nothing else going on. So this is a really big deal, and I've always thought that because Kenney's control of the party apparatus is so complete to this point, that he would be able to manage, his people would be able to manage the attendance. But, they had a big loss in Fort McMurray when they tried to do that in Brian Jean's riding, and also in the other Fort McMurray riding, Tony Dow's riding. So that kind of paradigm that Kenney never loses these things is kind of fracturing a bit. And I've come to the view that all the way from thinking that Kenney was a sure thing because of the way this thing is structured. I'm not saying it's crooked. I think they're being very careful that the rules, such as they are within what they're doing, are fair. But it is Jason Kenney's wheelhouse, getting people to support him to a specific place at a specific time, pizza at the ready, buses rolling kind of thing. That's his kind of thing. But what I'm hearing more and more is that there are so many people who want to participate in this thing, and they're not necessarily friendly to the Premier's future, that he will have trouble actually winning. Now, what is winning? That's the next thing. He said 65%.
Yeah.
And anything less than that, well, I think it's entirely possible he could get less than. Okay, so now between now and then, this is February, between now and then, he's got a couple of months, and maybe the environment changes, which is what he had been hoping for all along, that the economy would improve, COVID would fade, but it just keeps coming at him. In a way, his political luck has been pretty dreadful, and the crises just keep coming day after day, and it's hard to imagine a kind of Elysian Fields month of March, even now, that would help in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've known for a while that there are people within the United Conservative Party who are unhappy with restrictions and the way that the Premier has managed the pandemic, and there are people outside the party. You mentioned Dr. Vipond, who's been no fan of the Premier's handling of this pandemic. I was surprised that with some of the reaction that came out Tuesday evening. You had school boards who were upset that they wouldn't have the ability to enforce mask mandates. They weren't consulted on this. And even the business community seemed pretty upset that all of a sudden, member businesses from the Chamber of Commerce would have to be, deciding on their own whether they want to keep asking for vaccine proof of vaccination, and the kind of pressure that puts on them. What did you make of some of the reaction that we saw Tuesday evening?
I don't think it's surprising at all, Dave, because there's a psychology has been built here. The psychology, governments have done a pretty good job of saying, get vaccinated, be careful, here's how you catch the virus. I mean, we've all had 2 years of getting used to dealing with this in our own way. And to just suddenly flip the switch like that, it doesn't work. I mean, the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, Debbie Edlin, former Herald columnist at University of Calgary Chancellor, big, highly respected person in Calgary. She came out last night with a statement saying they were alarmed by this. It's too quick. So it goes all the way from there to the whole NDP side, which is ferociously against anything Kenney does, to the people in the middle. And I think it's at bottom, it's because of lack of preparation for the trying to manage the psychology of this. Like, this is the kind of thing that maybe should have been the subject of a open for summer type pre-campaign before, to get people used to the idea of what it's going to be like without the measures. Like, what is it going to be like? What does it mean if I walk into Safeway without a mask or with a mask? What does it mean if I go to a restaurant today? None of that has been even touched upon. And last night at about 9 o'clock, that is on Tuesday evening, the day of the announcement, I was trying to find out if if the QR codes were going to be canceled. Like if you walk into a store today and they say, please let us see your QR, and then they hold up their phone to my phone, is it even going to work on their end? So that's a real question for businesses. Is this system still functional? Well, it turns out that it did. It is still functional. Well, I had to go back and forth with the Premier's office for some time to get that detail, right? And I don't fault them for that, but my point is that this is all of a sudden we're ordered to have a major change in our thinking, and a lot of people simply aren't comfortable with that. They will be, but not yet.
Yeah, and one of there's a bit of a wrench in this all if you live in one of the big cities, and you're in Calgary and I'm in Edmonton, and there's been a lot of talk of what are places like Alberta's major cities going to do as they have their own masking bylaws. Calgary, I believe, has its own vaccination passport bylaw as well. And Jason Kenney's talked about wanting to remove those powers from cities to implement their own public health measures. I know in Tuesday's press event, he talked about looking at options. So maybe he's not as certain as he was previously when he did his Facebook Live and he raised the issue. But what are things going to look like in Calgary and Edmonton? Are the city councils there going to go their own way, and possibly fight with the province over this, or are we going to see these restrictions lifted in the cities as well?
Well, first of all, I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding about the REP or the vaccine passport. Calgary has a bylaw that includes the vaccine mandate, and that it just basically echoes the provincial policy. Now, there was a press conference with Mayor Jody Gondek last night in which she said what was obvious to people who knew what was going on, that it's automatically null and void because it stood upon the provincial REP. So it's of no effect anymore. That's the passport. But the masking situation is different, and there's a mask bylaw here as well, and that's a standalone. That can exist without a provincial measure. So that's when we're going to run into the rubber's going to hit the road, as it were, when the councils decide. And my understanding of the mood on our council here is that it's kind of in favor of continuing the masking, indoor masking, and work at home and all that for the time being. So that could lead to conflict. Now, Kenny's position on this, it's somehow the cities are screwing them up. It's kind of hard to credit, because remember at the beginning, Dave, when the province did not want to implement masking orders and other measures in large parts of rural Alberta because they weren't for it at all. So the cities got to do the job. They said, the cities can do it if they want, and the cities did, and they took the heat for it. And now Kenny's saying, oh gosh, you shouldn't do that. I mean, once again, it's a question of consistency, right?
I guess we'll see how that fight goes next for the province. We'll leave it there for today. More from Don Braid at CalgaryHerald.com. Don, thanks for your time.
Thanks a lot, Dave.
That's it for this episode of Under the Dome. Don't forget you can find all past episodes at edmontonjournal.com/underthedome, or you can hit that subscribe button on YouTube. I'm Dave Breckenridge. We'll see you next time.